Our next session is on compassion research and neuroscience. Our moderator is one of our close friends in CCARE, Brian Knutson, in the psychology department, and neurosciences here at Stanford. He got his BA at Trinity College in experimental psychology and his PhD in experimental psychology here at Stanford. His main area of interest is the neurobases of emotional experience and expression. He's really been quite a delight working with in terms of our efforts with CCARE, and he will be moderating our next session.
So our first speaker will be Richie Davidson. He's currently the Vilas Professor of Psychology and at the University of Wisconsin and Psychiatry since 1984. He's an international expert in emotion research, having authored over 300 articles and edited over 15 books, and is well known for his early work associating resting asymmetries in cortical function and the electrical activity of the cortex with mood. The comprehensive scope and implications of his work for affective and anxiety disorders have brought him numerous awards, and they include the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Society, William James Fellow Award from the American Psychological Association, and the 100 Most Influential People in the World Award from Time Magazine in 2006. And as you can guess, these two are good friends. I personally want to say that I owe a great debt to Richie's mentorship during my postdoctoral training, along with Jaak Panksepp and Paul Ekman, way back in the mid-90s, when only a handful of people were brave enough to talk about emotion and the brain in the same sentence. Richie was a pioneer of affective neuroscience. And in addition to that, he's also a pioneer of studying the neurophysiology of meditation, an interest he's held since his early career, regardless of the shifting tides of scientific approval of that topic around him. So I'm happy that our paths keep crossing and to have the chance to introduce him to you today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say about his new work. Please welcome Richie Davidson.
Let me just say that it's just a real treat to be here. I want to thank Jimpala and the other members of CCARE for not only the meeting, but the very fact of the existence of the center here at Stanford. I think it's a great achievement, and it sends a very important message to the world. I really have been moved very deeply by the rapidity of the sea change that we are seeing in the academy with respect to receptivity to this area. And it's a very heartening transition and opportunity. And also to see people like Brian and Jeannie, and James, many other people who are part of the beginnings of the neuroscience of emotion many, many years ago, when we were first starting out, and here all together with a serious interest in this topic also is just incredibly moving to me and personally very significant. So I just want to have that as a little introduction. What I'm going to do today is really a departure from what we've heard before. I'm actually going to show some data. Let me just preface this by saying that we are at an incredibly early stage. I want to just say a few caveats at the beginning. We're really at a very, very early stage. Every study that I'm going to present has very significant limitations. We can talk about those limitations, but we needed to start somewhere. And so this will be an introduction to where we are at the present point in time. But it really is offered with a large dose of humility about how much we still have to go. And the very preliminary nature of what I'm going to be describing. I want to first talk about the initial adventure in this topic, which was our thought that in order to find out something about what's going on in the brain during compassion, why not start with people who claim to be experts, people who have spent a good portion of their life cultivating their mind in ways to promote these kinds of qualities, who have spent thousands of hours. Actually, the mean number of hours of the participants I will describe in the first part of my talk who have been in formal practice is approximately 34,000 hours. In order to gain entrance into the study, a participant had to have a minimum of 10,000 hours of practice. And so these are highly accomplished practitioners. And we started incredibly simply with the crudest of experimental designs. I'll show you what those look like in just a moment. We started with practices that are central to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition in the voluntary cultivation of compassion. You've heard quite a bit about that this morning, particularly in Jimpa's presentation. And the practitioners that we flew to Madison, Wisconsin to participate in this study mostly resided in Asia and have been engaged in practices similar to the ones that Jimpa described. We began with this extraordinarily simple kind of design, which is the most simple kind of block design imaginable, where we had periods of meditation practice that were alternated with neutral states. Now, we can spend the rest of my time talking about what we mean by neutral states, and particularly among this rarefied group of individuals. And I think it's fair to say that their neutral state is not our neutral state. In fact, there are some neural correlates of their baseline state which differentiate them from others who have not participated in this kind of formal practice. But this is the way we began, an incredibly simple way. One of the things that we did is during the meditation practice, we challenged the practitioners with stimuli that were designed to depict and provoke strong emotion. Since the practitioners, although in this kind of practice, their eyes are not typically closed, but they're partially closed, we decided we should present auditory stimuli. It was just easier for this kind of information to get into the nervous system in this practice. And so during particular portions of the practice, we presented extremely loud auditory stimuli that depicted either suffering or pleasure. The kinds of sounds of suffering were sounds like people screaming, and signs of pleasure were a baby laughing, as an example. So these are the kinds of sounds that were presented. I'll first just talk about our very first observation that we made when practitioners did this. And this was published a number of years ago. I won't go over this in detail. Some of you probably know these findings. But this was a very robust finding that was very dramatic. And we still, to this day, don't really, the honest truth is, fully understand its significance. But let me first describe in one of the practitioners' words exactly what they were doing. This is in the words of Mathieu Ricard. He was one of our practitioners who participated in this experiment, and he said, here what we have tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which loving compassion permeate the whole mind with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts. This is sometimes called pure compassion or non-referential compassion. Now, one of the reasons why we chose to have the practitioners engage in this kind of practice was really for experimental reasons. If practitioners were invoking the image of another, if they were imagining a stranger or individuals who are close to them and doing a practice of the sort that Jimpa described earlier, there are areas of the brain that we know are going to be recruited that may have important things to do with memory, with the retrieval of this kind of information, and so forth, with visual imagery. And so we wanted to try to have these practitioners evoke a state of compassion with little else going on of a conceptual sort. That was our motivation for wanting to have them do this sort of practice. It's not a practice which is canonical, I think, although John and Jimpala can correct me. I don't know if you, let's wait on the corrections. There may be a whole list, so you can start keeping notes. Okay. So these are just some images of practitioners in our lab. This is Antoine Lutz, who is here today, and Antoine is the one who really drove all these experiments with the long-term practitioners, and has been absolutely central to the success, to the extent that we've had any of this work to date. And we spent a lot of time just hanging out with these guys and learning from them, and they were the ones who were instrumental in helping us design these experiments. And I should say, I will also say this again at the end, but another person who is absolutely crucial to the success of these experiments and initiating them is John Dunn, who was actually a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin at that time that we started this work. And I think it's fair to say that we could never have done this without John's very active participation. There was a period of time when I think he was spending as much time in our lab as he was over where he was really supposed to be. This is just giving Mathieu instructions for a meditation period, and this is Mathieu after he had been in the scanner for about 3 hours, and I often say that most people don't look like this when they come out after being in for so long. These are very unusual participants to have around the lab. And they've also helped us run our experiments. So the very first observation that we made is a very simple observation, although its significance is still to be determined. And that is when practitioners begin to meditate using this style of meditation, they show a dramatic increase in gamma oscillations in roughly the 40 hertz range. You can see that in this raw record here. This was published several years ago. And they also show a pronounced enhancement of synchrony of gamma oscillations across widespread regions of the scalp. We have spent a lot of time, and in the supplementary material to this PNAS paper, the issue of muscle artifact was addressed for those neuroscientists who know about this. And this is an ongoing issue, and I'd be happy to comment on it if anyone is interested. But it's a big methodological diversion, but nevertheless an important one that needs to be resolved. I think it's fair to say, honestly, that it has not been resolved to date. I don't think anyone can claim that these measurements are entirely free of muscle contributions, but I am convinced that muscle contributions do not account for all of the phenomena that we've observed. So I'll leave it at that, but we can talk more about that in the question and answer period. These are the data from the original PNAS report where we had 8 practitioners. We now have measured this phenomenon in about 18 practitioners. I should say that we've had quite a few female practitioners recently, so this phenomenon is not restricted to male monks, but in fact we have seen it in men and women who are both monastics as well as lay practitioners. These are the individual practitioners, and just displaying the percentage increase in gamma oscillations. And this figure here, the IB stands for the initial baseline, OB stands for the ongoing baseline, that is the baselines between the meditation practices, and the MS stands for the meditation state itself. There actually was a significant difference at baseline in the initial baseline that differentiated the practitioners from the controls. And so this just is going back to the comment I made earlier that their neutral state is likely something somewhat different from our neutral state, and this is an issue that I think needs to be better characterized. One of the things that we did in this initial report is simply we interviewed these practitioners in a very detailed way and obtained a lifetime history of their practice. And it was done very conservatively because during the time that they were on retreat, each of them has done a minimum of 1 3-year retreat. And for their time on retreat, we estimated 8 hours per day of practice, which actually is likely a large underestimate, particularly for a number of these practitioners. And so based upon the interview that we did, we calculated a lifetime number of hours of formal practice and simply looked at the relation between the number of lifetime hours of formal practice and the magnitude of enhancement in the gamma signal when you look from neutral to baseline, from neutral to the compassion meditation periods. And what you see in this small group of practitioners, but we see this in the larger group as well, is a strong relation between the number of years of practice, number of hours of lifetime practice, and the magnitude of enhancement in the gamma signal. More recently, we have used other methods to begin to interrogate in a more detailed way what's going on in the brain during the voluntary cultivation of compassion. And here is where we were specifically looking at changes in the brain that are evoked by the emotional stimuli that we present, the auditory emotional stimuli that we present. And there are a number of things that we've observed that are interesting and actually go back to some, I think, extremely important comments that Robert made in his remarks early this morning, which is that the brain uses circuits that have been conserved over the course of evolution for different things, and there is no specific circuit, I would contend, that is dedicated to compassion, but rather what we see is that compassion training affects parts of the brain that we know to be involved in many other kinds of functions and tweaks the gain in those circuits in certain ways which may be specific to the presentation or to the occurrence of certain kinds of emotional stimuli, particularly those that may involve human suffering or the suffering of sentient beings. And so with that kind of as a prelude, these are some of the key findings. And again, this is work of Antoine Lutz's that was published recently. And what we show here are the signals from MRI in response to negative, neutral, and positive stimuli. And these are signals in the anterior insula. And one of the things that if you look down here, the red signals, the red lines are the practitioners, the blue lines are match controls, they're age and gender match controls. The solid line is the meditation state, the dotted line is the neutral state. And so if you look at the curves on the bottom left here, if you look at the blue curves from the controls, what you see is that the solid and the dotted line, which are the meditation and the neutral states, are pretty much overlapping. There's virtually no difference in the bold signal response to negative stimuli when the novices are taught this meditation practice compared to a neutral state. Among the long-term practitioners, there's a dramatic difference in the insula signal to these negative emotional stimuli when they are in a meditation state, when they are practicing this state of compassion that Mathieu described in his words, compared to a neutral state. And the modulation of activity in the insula is much greater when in response to negative stimuli than it is in response to other types of emotional stimuli. Now, interestingly, also, we see we ask for reports about the quality of the practice, and both the novices and the long-term practitioners give us ratings of the quality of the particular short meditation periods that we are studying in the laboratory. And if you contrast the self-rated periods where they are reporting that the practice is very good compared to very poor, you see some interesting differences, and particularly among the novices, interestingly, who are showing a big difference between the epochs that their rating is poor compared to those that their rating is good. Among the long-term practitioners, there's a slight difference, but you can see that even during what they call poor periods of meditation, they're showing strong modulation of the insula. Now, there are a number of other parts of the brain and circuits that we know to be involved in emotion and empathy that are also modulated by this practice of compassion. In particular, what we see on the left in this slide is a modulation of activity in the amygdala. And one way to think about this is that this may be associated with the sense of experiencing the unbearable suffering, the unbearable nature of other suffering, and this is something that is recruiting circuitry in the brain that we know is involved in certain aspects of emotion, the detection of certain types of threats, and so forth. And so the activity in the amygdala is more significantly modulated among the long-term practitioners compared to the novice controls. And we also see a similar pattern in the TPJ, or temporal parietal junction, an area that has been implicated in empathy and in perspective taking. And there again, we see a much more dramatic modulation of activity in the long-term practitioners compared to the controls. And it's decidedly more right-sided, which is consistent with other findings in the literature as well. More recently, in examining these data, one of the things that has become of interest to us is looking at autonomic changes in addition to changes that are occurring in the brain. I mentioned in the small little meeting that we had with Jimpala and others this little anecdote, but I'll tell everyone this anecdote because it's really, I think, has some important grain of truth. And that is, when we were first trying to start up this kind of research in India in 1992 on an incredible journey that Cliff was part of, we were asked to give a talk by His Holiness to a group of young monks at the Namgyal Monastery to explain to them a little bit about what we were doing and about science. His Holiness was very interested in beginning at that time in increasing the exposure of these young monks to modern science. And so we gave this talk, and Francisco Varela was with us there. And we had all this equipment with us because we came with the naive hope and expectation that we'd actually be able to collect some data in the field. Turns out we weren't able to collect a shred of data, but that's a whole other story. But we did have all this equipment. We didn't want it to go for naught, and so we brought it to the Namgyal Monastery, and we actually thought that instead of just giving a kind of academic talk, we'd actually give a demonstration of recording brain electrical activity. So we put an electrode cap on Francisco Varela, and as soon as we put the cap on and showed this brain electrical activity on a laptop computer, there were 200 monks that were sitting on the floor, and they just burst out laughing. And they just were laughing and laughing and laughing, and it took a while for them to stop laughing. And of course, we assumed that they were just cracking up because Francisco looked a little odd with the electrode cap on his head. It turned out that that's not what they were laughing about at all. What they were laughing about is that we were actually trying to measure something about compassion from the head as opposed to the heart. That's what they were laughing about. They thought we had our electrodes in the wrong place. So it took us many, many years, actually about a decade or more than a decade, to begin to look at what's going on in the heart and in relation to the brain. And it turns out that when you look at what's going on in the heart, if you just look at a simple measure of heart rate, what you see is that in the expert practitioners, they are showing a small but significantly larger heart rate elevation when they are doing this compassion practice compared to the novices. But what's even more interesting is that if you look at the coupling between the heart rate change and what's going on in the brain, there are dramatic differences between the long-term practitioners and the novices. So what these data show is that in the insula, for the experts, particularly when they are doing the compassion practice, there is stronger coupling between activity in the insula region of the brain and heart rate compared to the novice practitioners. That's what's depicted over in the right-hand most side here. And this kind of pattern is present in other parts of this circuitry as well. This is a very large region of the brain that includes parts of the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex as well as the premotor and supplementary motor regions. And this is an area where you see, again, greater coupling in the experts compared to the novices, specifically during compassion practice. This is a very brief synopsis of work that we've done in the experts, and we have been stimulated by the kind of questions that we receive as well as just the intrinsic interest in seeing if we can investigate any of these kinds of things in totally different a group of individuals, people who are ranked novices, who are taught this practice over a very short period of time. And so we designed a 2-week intervention. And one of the novel features of this is that this involved practicing for 30 minutes a day, and the intervention was delivered over the internet. And this obviously has, if this works, so to speak, it has very important consequences in terms of its scalability. But the other thing is, for experimental purposes, it offered a really useful virtue in us being able to actually measure how long each day people were actually logged on to this protected website and receiving the instructions. And so it afforded a lot of experimental control, which was very desirable. We compared this to an active comparison group where they were taught a kind of cognitive therapy, cognitive reappraisal training that is derived from cognitive therapy, and this was done in the structurally analogous way. They were practicing for 30 minutes a day in the same kind of way for 2 weeks. I should mention that this study is being driven by Helen Wang. Helen is a wonderfully talented graduate student of mine who is actually here, and she can answer detailed questions about this study. And this is still very much a study in progress, and what I'm offering you is really an extremely interim progress report. Just briefly about the elements of compassion training, participants were asked to contemplate and visualize the suffering, and then wishing the freedom from suffering for a loved one, for themselves, for a stranger, for a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons, and then for all beings. We had participants silently repeat phrases. A phrase that was most often used is, "May you be free from suffering, may you experience joy and ease." The participants were instructed to notice visceral sensations, especially around the area of the heart as they were doing this. They were instructed to feel the compassion emotionally, not simply repeat the phrases cognitively. And those were the key elements of this training. And it occurred, as I said, for 30 minutes a day over the course of 2 weeks. We collected both brain data as well as other kinds of behavioral data before and after the 2 weeks of training. They got scans before and after. I should say participants were randomly assigned to the compassion group or to the cognitive reappraisal group after the initial assessment period. We obtained a number of self-report measures. They also engaged in a donation task, and we also had them do an economic game, which I'm going to mention here. I know that there's a session on economics tomorrow. I did want to include this here to really get the comments of the economists here. So I'd be very interested to hear your reactions. We designed this game, and this game was designed by Drew Fox, who's another super talented graduate student of mine who's here, and Helen Wang. We've called this variously the Robin Hood game or the redistribution of wealth game. And the way it works, I'll walk you through this. There are 3 parties to this game. There's a dictator, a recipient, and a third party. The dictator is endowed with a certain sum to begin with, and the dictator can pass a certain amount of money to the recipient. The third party is endowed with also a sum of money. And in the second step of this game, it's a 2-step game, the third party can redistribute the money from the dictator to the recipient. That is, the third party can use some of his money to force the dictator, if you will, to transfer more, to render the transaction more altruistic. And what we're, and I should also mention that the third parties, when the third party uses his money to redistribute wealth, the sum is doubled. So he begins with a sum of 50, and it's doubled in the process. That is, what's doubled is the amount of money transferred from the dictator to the recipient. So that's the way the game works, and we are particularly interested in the behavior of the third party here. And we're interested to know if compassion training actually affects the propensity of a subject who is in the role of the third party to behave more altruistically and use more of his money to redistribute the wealth in this game. Very, very briefly, let me just show you a couple of snippets. And these data are still actively being analyzed, and so there are a lot of caveats here. We've not finished by any means the analyses. We're very much in the middle of them. It turned out that one of the things that we observed early on in these analyses, which was not expected, is a big gender difference. And what we see, it was a modified emotion regulation paradigm where participants were shown images that specifically depicted human suffering, and they were instructed to use the training that they received, that is either compassion training or reappraisal training, to when they were exposed to these images. So that was the instruction. And we were looking at the changes in the brain in response to the identical kinds of emotional stimuli when participants were invoking the compassion training compared to a group that was trained with cognitive reappraisal. Now, if you look at the relation between these signals and how much money people donate, first of all, let me say that this was a real index. That is, people were actually donating real money. They executed a transaction online in the laboratory. There was no deception involved. They were asked if they were willing to donate any of the $165 they earned for this study to any charitable cause of their choosing. The responses were given in privacy on the internet, and the money was actually donated. So let me end by just raising a few questions. And some of these questions bear on what I directly talked about, and other questions really are questions for the future that I haven't addressed at all. The first is what is the functional significance of the different brain signals that we've observed in response to compassion training? This talk was too short for me to really go into it, but I do think that I want to come back to Robert's very important comments earlier, because I think that that's a very important framework for thinking about how we should think about these changes. Other questions that are, I think, extremely important in this area is the relation between the cultivation of compassion and self-related processes. In particular, how is self-identification modulated by compassion training, and are some of the effects produced by compassion training mediated, at least in part, by their impact on self-relevant processing? Something that we've gotten very interested in is pain. Pain is something that can very easily be measured in terms of its neural signature. And one interesting question is the relation between self-compassion and pain. And is pain a useful probe in the empirical study of the impact of compassion training? How does the cultivation of compassion increase the likelihood of acting in the face of suffering? And how best should this question be studied in the laboratory? This is why I asked John Dunn the question of, okay, you know, I think it's wonderful that the Buddhists tell us that behavioral change is the ultimate criterion, but we need help in devising proper behavioral measures that we can actually harness in the laboratory to anchor these kinds of studies. And what is the impact? This represents an entirely different strategy for studying compassion, which I think is really important and may be the most tractable. And that is, what is the impact of a highly compassionate person on others in his or her surrounding? And is this interpersonal context a viable one to bring into the laboratory? And here I think this really could be very, very tractable, and there are already models for how to do this. And this is something that we hope to be doing in the near future. And finally, and this relates to a question that I asked earlier, what is the relations among the four immeasurables that we heard about from Jimpa earlier? Does cultivating one strengthen each of the others? Is there a normative developmental progression of these different qualities? And what do the contemplative traditions have to say about this? And I think this is something that we're going to need to probe in the future. So thank you all very much for your attention.
Two points, Richie. In the paper that's under review right now, we were able to demonstrate the impact of a compassionate person on the physiology of a difficult person in a 15-minute period. The second is, have you been able, using the various paradigms and methods, identify any individuals who have not been trained, who are acting in the same sphere as the people who are trained, or your more select group of lifetime training?
Yeah, it's first of all, thank you about the observation and the report that's submitted. I look forward to seeing it. I've heard about the data, but I've never seen them. With respect to the second issue, one of the things that I didn't have time to go over is that in the very first study that I presented with the EEG data, it turns out that among the novice practitioners, there were 10 novices in that first report who had never practiced before, but all of whom expressed interest. There are actually 2 people out of the 10 who showed a significant increase in the gamma oscillations during compassion practice after 1 week of training. And so that's interesting, and I think that we can begin to study those individuals, and this may be related to some naturally occurring difference that I think is worthy of exploration.
Thank you.
I have 2 brief questions, well, I hope they're brief, about technical questions about the fMRI. In your first study, where you're comparing a group of adepts with a group of novices, is there not a scanner effect, and how do you control for it? Because you showed the picture of the monk who'd been in the scanner for 3 hours. You said that it's not normally the way people come out of the scanner. Scanning is a very difficult process for people, and novices are going to have much less equipment to deal with it.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. You know, in our lab, I think it's fair to say that we have a simulator, so people go through simulations before they go into the real scanner. Sometimes they do multiple simulations to reduce their anxiety. I think that most people in our lab actually have a good time in the scanner. Mm-hmm. But you know, that's kind of, you know, in all seriousness, I think that it's an issue, and it's an issue that we do our best to work with, and we have the simulation session to reduce the anxiety among the novices. But when you're dealing with a rarefied group like this, there are so many differences between this group and the novice group that potentially could explain these findings that may have nothing to do with the practice itself. And so I think that it's going to take us quite a bit of time to start peeling away the so-called active ingredient. But that's why we were led to wanting to do the studies in rank novices who we randomly assign to one or another group, because then we can say much more definitively that the changes that we see have something to do with the practices that we've given them.
And my other comment is that with fMRI, there's no way of distinguishing excitation from inhibition.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that plagues every fMRI study, and you know, we can spend a week on the limitations of fMRI. And that's all true. And so it's very important that we need to be broad in the methodology that we bring to this and include all kinds of things. But I think that, you know, we had a small meeting before the official meeting with folks here at Stanford, and one of the questions was, what's going to be most helpful in terms of really making progress in the future? And a question was asked about whether, you know, new machines are really going to be helpful. And my response is no. It's not going to. The answer is not going to come from new machines. I think it'll be more from devising better behavioral procedures for capturing the behavioral impact of compassion, which is where I think a lot of the work is going to need to be. Once we have a very good, reliable behavioral signature, if you will, we can then begin to probe some of the underlying neural bases with more rigor.
Our next speaker is Tania Singer. Yeah, you can. Can you sing? She's currently a professor of neuroscience at the University of Zurich, and she holds the inaugural chair of social neuroscience and neuroeconomics since 2006. She completed her dissertation on plasticity and aging at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin before doing postdoctoral work on social neuroscience at the University College of London. She's done some of the earliest work using neuroimaging to examine the neural underpinnings of empathy and fairness. I first met Tania as a dynamic new hire at a neurofinance conference in Zurich. And there she has really branched out in her initial work to investigate not only neural, but hormonal and psychological mechanisms underlying empathy, perspective-taking, fairness, altruism, revenge, reciprocity, and using multiple methods, including neuroimaging, but also using peripheral physiology and endocrine output. So I'm really looking forward to hearing about some of her new work and thoughts today. Please join me in welcoming Tania Singer to the podium.
You will see that actually there is quite a lot of redundancy to the morning talks, and I think it's a good news because it means we are not as dispersed than we thought we were in the different fields. So I'm quite pleased actually to see how much concordance there is if you just sometimes change the names or the words. You know, we mean the same concept. Then what I want to do is just to show you a little bit what we know in neuroscience about these different concepts, but I can only be very short and not actually go into details of imaging data too much. And then I would like to discuss or put some very new hypotheses, much more like lines of thoughts around to the public, because I know there are also economists, and this is an issue which I'm quite concerned at the moment, is to think about the differences between fairness-based motivation and compassion-based motivation for cooperation in society. And that's really based on basically work in economics and game theory, and it's really open, but I wanted to have some minutes to talk about that too at the end. Okay, so clarification of terms. That is very much, I think you will recognize what we heard from you this morning, but perhaps adding some concepts to the picture, like emotion contagion or mimicry, and you spoke about that. So we know that already, children have that when they scream. If I would start yawning, you would start yawning. Very implicit contagious effect. We have data on pupillary contagion. So if you look in sad faces and people have, changed their pupillary, your pupillary will change at the function of the pupillary change in the other person, but of course you're not conscious. If you ask people, did your pupillary change? They're like, sorry, what do you want? So this is kind of very unconscious, and we have imaging data that, knowing which brain process actually mediating. And I think people working on apes would agree that, all animals probably have emotion contagion, apes for sure. Now, the question whether apes have empathy and all the sisters coming along, that I think is really an open question. And even if Deval likes to show unique cases of apes, helping other people, I think there is a big controversy, actually, whether that's really true or not in general. So empathy, for example, comes in if you are aware that the emotion you are now carrying is a vicariously emotion carried for the other. So, I share your pain, but I know it's not mine. In emotion contagion, you don't know. You just have an emotion contagious by the other, but you don't know where it comes from. In empathy, you are aware, and so you need a self-other distinction for that. And there is a big, discussion which animals have a self-other distinction. And there was this elephant test with the mirror image, and so there is some evidence that, for example, elephant have passed the mirror and have a self-other distinction, which might be interesting in terms of thinking that they might perhaps have empathy, and animals who do not pass this test would not have. The thing which is a bit tricky is that we define empathy as being aware that you cannot vicariously feeling for the other, but animals you cannot ask. So you have to infer that through the behavior of the animal, which is, of course, a bit tricky. Anyway, that's just to say that we distinguish empathy from another sister, which we call cognitive perspective taking or theory of mind, or other people have said it's a cognitive empathy and an emotional empathy. So there are very different terms around, but I think all the people mean the same. Basically, one is to know what the more abstract concept of the other person is. It's like the belief, the thoughts, but it's not a feeling. It's not sharing an affective state with the other person. So that's the difference between empathy or emotional perspective taking and cognitive perspective taking. And that's not just a random distinction, but we have more and more evidence from neuroimaging that actually the brain circuitry are very different, which underlie these two roots to the understanding of the other people, and that in psychopathology you even find double dissociation. And we're just looking a little bit more close to data. I will show you perhaps just a glimpse of it, that it's really true. If you can find double dissociation or evidence of that. So now empathy, and we think about this also as a kind of evolution and ontogenetically chain, so sympathy or compassion or empathic concern, they're all somehow the same. Just the people, tend to use sometimes compassion or sympathy. Perhaps there is a difference between sympathy and compassion, and I think even Buddhists, have this distinction, and perhaps you can tell me whether that's true. When I was in India, in Sanat, I asked some Buddhist scholars, and they said that they actually also do the difference. Sympathy is, for example, imagine you are like extremely jealous, and I feel like, oh, I'm sorry for you. But I don't share the same emotion. That would be empathy. I cannot be jealous with you, Jealousy is directed towards another person. But sympathy can have some condescending aspect to it. So it's like, I'm on top and I feel sorry for you. But compassion never have that. Compassion is really the appreciation that we are all the same, that we are all on the same level. So you could take sympathy as a concern for the other, but perhaps a little bit condescending, whereas compassion is really something where you have the deep understanding of a connectivity and a sameness of everyone, and this is why compassion rises. So that's a subtle distinction, but I think perhaps worth talking. And then, of course, why are we so interested in this chain is because we want to know what actually predicts for social behavior or antisocial behavior, and we want to know, whether you need one for the other and how that relates to behavior. And we have heard that in lots of tradition, I think behavior is what matters. And I agree with Richie that we don't know actually well how to measure behavior, and we are now, working on a lot of tasks in our lab, and it's actually quite tricky. So, so that's just reiterating the definition of empathy you might take is that you need an affective state, that this is kind of isomorphic to the other state, that this state is elicited by the perception, or imagination can also be imagination of someone else, and that you know that the source of the emotion is the other person. And so cognitive perspective taking differs in the first claim, sympathy differs in the second claim, and emotion contagion would differ in the last claim. Okay, so that's just a reiteration of how we would conceive that, and I think there is pretty much of an agreement actually from developmental psychology, and probably perhaps if we term the terms, if I would say instead of empathy, I would call it direct resonance, and if emotion contagion would be something like emotion recognition or something, that kind of no, that would probably not, I don't know. Emotion recognition for me has nothing to do with the sisters of empathy, but it's a necessary condition for all the other to arise. So that would be my take. Okay. So now compassion, I have just looked it up because I think in social neuroscience it's probably the most difficult term to define because of the complexity, as we have heard before. And just looking at the dictionaries, which are around in the world, I thought it's quite amazing that it maps a lot the Buddhist definition. I think that it's at least, perhaps even more, two things, a feeling and a motivation to act. And so that's also included in these, for example, American heritage. It's a deep awareness of the suffering of another coupled with the wish to relieve it. So you have to have this coupling and human quality of understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it. And that's really making this completely different from empathy or emotion contagion. Now, how we would measure that in the brain is a complete different question, because I think we have perhaps a concept of how we measure emotions in the brain, even though that's not clear. But how we measure actually an action disposition or kind of a motivation, that's a very difficult thing. I don't know whether you agree, but we need to think more about that. Okay, so now then there is another claim, as I pointed out. We have a kind of ontogenetic sequence and also perhaps phylogenetic sequence from emotion contagion to empathy to compassion. And so I just perhaps point out kind of a very preliminary model, very rudimentary, but you could say there are different developmental traits for the cognitive perspective and the emotional perspective for the sisters of empathy, starting with emotion contagion very early. Then there is an understanding of self and other coming along, but you will know much better about that. I mean, I'm happy about any feedback, so that empathy can develop, then sympathy or empathic concern can develop. And for compassion, I think, and that is what you also alluded to, is a very important component is actually emotional regulation and top-down control, and I think child development research shows that in a very nice way. And what we try now is to develop actually a paradigm for the use of scanning, where you can see this interaction between emotion regulation capacity, which are heavily relying on prefrontal cortex function, and the ability to understand another person, even if you are, for example, in an inconsistent emotional state. So imagine you are extremely happy because you won a lot, but you have to understand how Brian feels, and he just lost on the stock market everything, you see. So this is what we call egocentricity bias. If I cannot regulate my own states, I would come to a simulation of your state according to my own, without taking this into account that you're another person and that I have to detach myself from my own emotion to come to an adequate judgment of you. And social psychologists know that under the term of egocentricity bias. it's not only children who have that, it's, a lot of adults have that too. And the idea is basically, I don't want to go too directly into the model, but this is a developing brain, and you see whenever it gets more blue, that means it matures and develops much later than the... So you see that here the white DLPFC and also the TPJ here, the posterior STS and TPJ, mature very, very late in ontogeny. So up to an age of 25, there is still movement going on. That's just structural data. We don't know how it maps to functions, but it's a very interesting developmental pattern. So what we now try to show is that if you put children is not so small than you, because if you want to scan them, they have to be 6 to 7 because they move very much. But if you put them in a situation where either they are in a positive emotional state and they have to judge the other in a positive emotional state, they can just simulate themselves like egocentrically on the other projected. But if they are in an incongruent state and the other is you're in a positive, the other in negative, or the other way around, what they have to do is probably use these parts of the brain to inhibit their own emotional state and to come to an accurate understanding of this other person as being different from you. And what we see, at least in adults, and the imaging data in the children are not there yet, is that the TPJ is a very important part of it, and that's exactly the part which develops so late. So we expect that we will find a developmental trend in that. That's just work, showing the interplay between emotion regulation capacities and empathy, or more primitive kind of functions. Okay, so now I don't think I'll talk about emotion contagion a lot, but perhaps I show you some summary data about what we know about empathy, because that's what I know best. And I think I don't have to talk too much about compassion anymore, perhaps just 2 or 3 data of an approach we had used, but it's really preliminary data, and it's just based on single brain, so it's very embarrassing if you see Richie's data with, 16 monks. We have just one monk, and nice monk, but it's early days, but I can just show you. Okay, that's very early data, and that's what has been alluded to in the morning. This is this kind of shared network hypothesis in empathy. So the idea was, if you watch people smelling disgusting odors, and you are smelling disgusting odors yourself lying in the scanner, is that evident that you use neural networks or brain areas in your brain you use actually to process smell in yourself to understand what it means for the other person to smell. And so indeed you see here the insula, and the insula it's my favorite brain area, because that's really crucially involved in whatever I do, even though I have not really understood the exact underlying function of this area. It's a very complex area, has not been investigated a lot, I think, in the past. So people just starting to understand the interaction between amygdala and insula. Anyway, that's another talk by itself. But you see here that these overlapping region is when you smell disgusting odor, you see someone else smelling disgusting odors. You have the same for taste. If the pleasant taste or disgusting taste, you see here either videos of people really there having disgusted taste, or neutral or kind of pleasant, and you see that there are these overlap activation also in the very anterior part of the insula for taste. And then I'll show you now a lot of examples from the domain of pain, because that's where I did most of the studies myself. And you see as well that you have evidence for these shared networks in the domain of pain. And then I'll talk also about empathy deficits in psychopathology, and about modulatory factors of these empathic brain response. So in these early days, what we did is to ask couples to come in, because we thought that if that doesn't work with couple, it will not work with anybody. So, we were optimistic about couples. So the couples actually asked us, is that a way you can say whether we are still in love with each other? We said, no, we don't do any diagnosis here. So what you see here... is that you have pain electrodes attached to the right hand and pain electrodes attached to the husband's hand, and the husband is sitting really, basically online in the scanner. The wife is lying in the scanner, and then on the screen you will see flashes, and the color of the flashes indicate whether you actually get pain or kind of tickling sensation. That's the baseline, that's the control baseline, or whether the partner gets pain or just tickling sensation. And the difference will tell you either what we call the pain matrix, this is a kind of network in the brain, or it will tell you what we call empathy for pain. It's basically, is there any evidence that you activate the same or different networks if you see your partner in pain, but you only know he is in pain? There is no visual display. There's no emotion contagion involved, you could say. So at the end, they were quite happy. Over. So that's the typical result. This is anterior insula and the anterior ACC, a little bit like what we have seen in the heartbeat changes. So this is typically, and then this is also correlation, and for the people who have followed the Discord, they are not voodoo, they are completely okay. There is no voodoo around. If you want to know more about that, I'm happy to talk about it. So these correlations have been replicated in many, many studies with many different methods, so it's all real. And you see that there are individual differences, as assessed by questionnaires, and they correlate to the activity in this network. And then there is probably now 30 studies around showing these empathic network, this overlap in anterior insula. This is like green when you get pain yourself, and this is red when you just see the other person in pain. And that happens irrespective of whether it's your partner or person you don't even know, but you have kind of gone to like them because you played games, or because you just see facial expression of pain, chronic pain, or people who have heard loud bangs, or a situation where you will actually feel pain or needles sticking into it. And it can even be a cartoon, and the activity is modulated in size, but it's always the same network. Okay, and we just run a meta-analysis lumping all these studies together in one model, and it's really consistent, always anterior insula and the ACC. Okay, so now, of course, we want to know more about the real functions of this activity. So it's always what we call the interoceptive cortex. It's the insula looking into the condition of your body, registering how you feel. And now we wanted to ask whether the hypothesis that we actually use representation of our own feeling state represented in the anterior insula to make a model about what other people feel. Yeah? And to test this hypothesis, we thought we might look in psychopathology in Asperger's syndrome, and especially in alexithymia, which is hugely correlated with Asperger's syndrome. You can assess this with a questionnaire, whether it's true that people who have deficits in understanding their own emotion states also show a deficit in interoceptive awareness, and then in another study in empathy. So that's just very shortly, you see pictures which are negative or positive, and then you have to rate how you feel about them, or you have to rate how much black and white is in the picture, complete external dimension. And the interaction gives you actually what we wanted. So the anterior insula is actually active if you have to interocept on emotions in the presence of emotion. But interestingly enough, Asperger's syndrome or autistic spectrum disorder is not predicting whether you can do it, but the degree of alexithymia. So there are some autistic people who have no symptoms in alexithymia. They have no comorbidity with that. And if you take only these, they show a complete normal pattern. So it's not autism per se, which will predict an interoceptive deficits, but it's the degree of alexithymia. And another thing which we found is that there is a huge correlation with the degree of alexithymia, negative correlation, and empathy in questionnaire. So now we wanted to know whether we, in a new study, using the same paradigm than before, the empathy paradigm, we could find an evidence that people who are very high in alexithymic, whether they are Asperger or controls, also show an empathy deficit. And what we found, these are data we're still processing because we also did a theory of mind task and we want to find a double dissociation, and it looks like that. But what you can see here already is that the controls and the ASD with low alexithymia, which are normal, in terms of their alexithymic traits, so they have no deficit in understanding their emotions when you ask them, they show complete normal empathic responses in this network. And it's only people who have a lack of understanding their emotions, so score high in alexithymia, which show a deficit, an empathetic deficit. So that's just a one study of a lot of studies which have now accumulated, showing that the activity in this network in anterior insula is not only modulated by alexithymia, for example, or psychopathology, but also by contextual factors. So this is a study we did on fairness, and fairness as it is kind of operationalized probably by economists. We used a sequential trust game. I don't know, you're probably all familiar with it. No? But, I mean, shortly saying, we had actors, confederates, which economists don't like. I know that now where I'm in economy department, I cannot cheat anymore, but at that time I could. And so we had women and men, and now that was not couples, but either the women were very fair, they played very fairly in a game, in a kind of monetary exchange game, repeatedly. So you really like them. I knew from previous studies that these games really work well in eliciting very strong emotion of hate and liking. So it's a way of experimentally inducing in the lab very strong feelings of liking and disliking, and you can also assess that in questionnaire. And people even don't, find the faces not attractive if they were unfair. So it's a very salient dimension, and we use these games to actually produce one who was fair and one who really repeatedly defected and was egoistic and unfair, and you really disliked. And then they got pain, and then you could see whether the activity in the brain is modulated by your perceived fairness of the other person. And that was the case, but only for the males. So overall, on average, we found empathic brain responses to the pain for fair and unfair people in women. But when we looked at the males, we saw actually kind of on average a complete lack of these empathic brain responses when they saw an unfair person suffering pain. When the fair person got pain, they were exactly the same. And when we looked at the reverse pattern, what we call Schadenfreude in German, if you laugh about the, kind of suffering of this poor penguin, and a lot of, all the males basically showed an increase in nuclear sarcomas, and you had seen that with Richie's data. That's a kind of area which it's quite relevant in reward processing, and that was correlated to a subjective desire for revenge. And I will come to this data later when I speak about fairness-based and compassion-based motivation, because fairness-based motivation predicts revenge and probably a satisfaction of seeing revenge being taken in the other. And the assumption is that compassion-based motivation would never predict such a pattern. So the idea is whether if you induce compassion training, as we have heard about this morning, is it possible to actually reverse this effect in the brain through equanimity training and compassion training? And that would probably also mean a lot in terms of predicting less wars, less fights. And perhaps this is data I cannot show you because they are also we just processed them, but we have extended this paradigm to in-group, out-group, so football teams, people who suffer pain from your own football team or from your outside football team, and you show exactly the same results of a very strong modulation in anterior insula for the people who are from your football team on average, but the people really differ in that too, and the amount of modulation or of activation in the insula predicts whether you are willing to share pain later. So if in a second phase you are allowed now to share the pain with the other so that the other don't have to suffer so much, the people who share more showed more empathic responses at the beginning. And I think that's, for me, the first evidence that these brain responses also show predict a behavioral outcome which is altruistic, because you take pain on yourself to alleviate basically the suffering of the other, and that's a function of how much empathy you have felt before. Okay, that's basically a table which shows all the factors which have been shown in neuroscience, social neuroscience, to affect empathic brain responses. Some of them I have alluded to, others you might ask me afterward if you are interested in. But we have already started to actually identify quite a lot of factors modulating these responses. Okay, so the summary is that the interoceptive cortex plays a crucial role in understanding your own and other people's feeling. Now we have we have more questions than we have answers. So what is exactly the function underlying, this activation we see in anterior insula? How does the insula differentiate between positive, negative affect, empathic concern, distress? All these is really, it's a really challenging question, but we have to address them in the future. deficits in understanding your own feeling, we have shown that at the example of alexithymia, are associated with lack of empathy and less activation in the interoceptive cortex. So you might derive from that empathy training should always start to concentrate first to train interoceptive awareness in yourself before you start with others. And I think that some teachers I have talked in a Buddhist meditation teacher, especially in the West, they have all agreed that what they find out or what they do is first to teach people in compassion for themselves and understanding their own interoceptive emotions before they go to the others. So that would fit to the data. And then, as I showed you, these empathic brain responses are modulated by lots of factors. Okay, so I don't have to go here too much in detail because we heard so many beautiful data. And I think compassion in the brain is probably a chapter which is really open to exploration. So that's the Mind and Life conference where I also came into contact with Mathieu Ricard, which has shown these data. That's data from Antoine, which are beautifully shown that the insula is really important. I was so happy to see that in expert monks. So it's not only in empathy, but it seems to really have a crucial role in expertise of compassion as well. But now we have to understand, what is exactly the difference between distress and empathic concern. So what we do is, at the moment, is a kind of three-step procedure to start thinking about plasticity of the empathic brain or compassionate brain. And the first is, like which he said, it's basically using expert monks, but I mean, we have only looked at Mathieu Ricard's brain so far. So it will be a long process to get all these long-term meditators. It's really difficult to get them, into your lab. So it's really, I really appreciate your data with the 16 monks on this. Normally people don't even see the end, but it's really a lot of work. So then we want to explore, we want to measure whether empathy training has an effect on health and behavior and brain. And we will also be exploring the additional benefit of real-time fMRI. That's biofeedback from the brain. So you basically feedback the activity of the insula or the striatum to the person which is lying in the scanner, and then they have to learn to up and down regulate the activity. And we just wanted to see whether it's in any case beneficial to mental training or whether it's just making the thing much more complicated. And the latter is probably true. I mean, I just had a glimpse on the first 20 data coming back from Maastricht, and it's really difficult task. It's really triple task. So let's see what that is. Susanne Leiberg is the postdoc in my lab, which is really doing this real-time work. That's Mathieu, as you have seen, happy after 3 hours of. Also in Maastricht, he was happy. He's always happy. And what we did now is really to explore for ourselves, how these different states actually he can, Buddhist practitioner do. How do they map to the brain? What are the differences? What are the similarities? So that we know what we actually would expect if we train naive people in these techniques. So it's really more like kind of a piloting. But what we ask him, and I was quite astonished, is to actually not only go into a state and not, but to modulate the intensity of the compassion, or so to 30%, to 60%, or to 90%. So it's like a thermostat, and you have to regulate your feelings to kind of a parametric degree, and that allows you to map parametric function in the brain, which are related to the intensity they actually produce. And we thought, my God, that's quite difficult. I mean, if you would ask someone naive, can you go 90%, 60% into unconditional love? It's not usual. So, and Mathieu really produced extremely, over a lot of runs and over days, really, really nice data. And this is a conjunction analysis, which is really pulling together the brain area which show up in all the 3 states. So now we look for the similarities between metta, compassion, and the non-referential whatever. I mean, the thing which is not, object-focused, non-referential compassion, or objectless compassion. And so you see that what is really in common in these 3 states and modulated by intensity is the insula again and the striatum. And so we took these striatal region because it's interesting, as Brian probably knows, for reward and, kind of probably, even though there's a debate whether that's the hedonic valence or whether it's a learning signal, but here it seems more like with the hedonic dimension, because that's really how it's also correlated to how much he feels these things. So, and we also asked him, that's just because I was so astonished. I mean, it's just a single brain, anecdotal, you know, it's not science now, but we asked him, can you do pain? Because we didn't have our pain electrodes with. Could you just imagine to get pain on your right hand? And he produced a pain matrix modulated by intensity, which was as nice as what we get when we pool 20 people with real pain together. And he even showed as one activation, you know, if he was basically imagining pain on the right hand, he got as one on the left. So that was, for me as a pain researcher, was quite extraordinary to see that you can just by mere imagination, you know, produce this clear pattern of pain. Yeah. Now, the only thing which I wanted to put out there is that I thought we should think more about compassion-based and fairness-based motivation and their impact on cooperation in society, because I think, you know, if it comes about pro-social behavior, and so I think both motivation would predict, in the case of positive reciprocity, where people are able to, you know, to reciprocate your trust. When you have a compassion-based motivation or fairness-based, the same outcome will be predicted. Cooperation will be stable. But in the face of defectives, of people who cheat on you, who do not cooperate, what could be repeatedly shown is that cooperation goes down and breaks down very quickly. What could also be shown is that if you introduce punishment and, you know, the desire of revenge produces punishment, cooperation could maintain a little bit more stable. But what Batson and others showed, and Van Lange recently, is that if you do either an induction of empathy or you induce generosity and forgiveness, in kind of this game situation, what you can prevent is that defection is occurring immediately as a tit-for-tat strategy when you are confronted with defection. So it buffers the effect of cooperation breaking down in society. So now the big question would be if we can show that having compassion actually also on a larger scale of cooperation reduce this kind of defection circle going down. But on the same time, the risk is if you have only compassion-based motivation and no fairness-based motivation anymore, is that you can be exploited. So in the existence of defectors which are stable over time, people start to get exploited. So it's really the question, how will we model actually justice-based motivation of, you know, taking revenge, punishment, you know, and compassion-based motivation so that they are balanced and produce the best outcome, because only one of them will produce either one. But if you have only compassion-based motivation, I think it will not work. And that's, you know, future thoughts, and that's, you know, a conference we will have in 2010 with the Mind and Life Institute, actually on a bit of these, you know, how does compassion and altruistic motivation can fit into a competitive economic models, you know, how can you bring these together? Is there a place for it or not? Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Bill Mobley. He's currently the John E. Cahill Family Professor in the Stanford Medical School Department of Neurology since 1997. He's both an esteemed clinician and researcher. He's contributed seminal work to our understanding of nerve growth and maintenance with implications for Down syndrome and Alzheimer's disease. He's received many honors, including induction into the Institute of Medicine. I know Bill as a uniting force on campus who's not afraid to explore cross-disciplinary visions and connections. For instance, he's headed the Cross-Disciplinary Neuroscience Institute at Stanford, and later organized His Holiness's dialogue with neuroscientists, which culminated in the formation of CCARE. I just was sad to learn that Bill will leave us in 2 weeks to become the chair of neurology at UCSD, but San Diego is not far away. I suspect we'll be seeing lots of Bill in the future anyways. So please welcome Bill Mobley.
So I wanted this time to be a time when we could throw some ideas around, and I think I have certain responsibilities. The first responsibility as a neuroscientist is to begin to understand in some very intimate way the circuit basis of what we've heard about from the last two talks. And I'm very impressed about the regularity with which the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex are co-engaged in these activities that these tests of cognition, these events that people experience. Richie's data shows this. Your data shows this. Other people who don't really work directly on compassion or empathy show it. And so I did a little bit of reading, and let's just raise the possibility that these two brain regions are in fact very involved as, if you will, limbic sensory and limbic motor cortex, that the AI is a place where you understand in a fairly sophisticated way in response to all kinds of sensory information where I am right now. What do I know right now about me? And by reflectiveness, what do I know about that other person who I'm seeing right now? So is that what the AI does in part? And does the anterior cingulate engage differentially in either activating brainstem motor areas or downstream red nucleus and spinal cord motor areas? In other words, are we looking at AC and AI as essentially the integrators of a variety of information from cortex, from sensory pathways, and at ACC as connected with AI, and also with presumably some of these other sensory inputs, a motor response? So how do we think about that, Richie and Tania? What would you say to the posit that these are two little islands in the brain that studying would make a huge difference in our understanding or moving forward to really understand the neural basis of empathy and compassion? Richie, you first.
I certainly think that your intuitions are exactly right, and they're well placed. And I think that these are brain regions which have come up in both Tania's data, our data, and other data out there. I think that given what we're learning about the role of the insula, particularly the anterior insula, in viscerotopic representation, I think it leads to the question of what the role of visceral feedback might be in providing the brain with information that is important in compassionate responding.
Yeah.
And I think that there are studies that immediately come to mind to begin to dissect and examine the role of that kind of visceral information that may be relevant.
And I'm wondering in your talk whether this neurocardiac connectivity began in AI or was registered in AI. In other words, did my heartbeat go up by 3 plus or minus 1.5 beats per minute, which is a tiny difference? But was I aware of my heart before my head was aware of my other sensory state?
Yeah, well, it's a great question, and one that we've thought about. Clearly, the data that we have cannot resolve that.
Because it's temporally not good enough.
Right. I mean, one can imagine doing certain kinds of studies. I mean, you can use peripheral pharmacological blockades to begin to dissect this in ways that I think are safe and possible.
Yeah.
But those kinds of studies just haven't been done yet.
Right. Right. Tania, any thoughts, please, about these two? So as a neuroscientist, I want to say, where do I begin?
I guess we are far from really understanding exact functions of the insula, but I think I agree with Bud Craig's model, I think, most, which is an anatomically informed model, because when we do pain, but also if you look at other data looking on pleasant touch or taste or so, you see a posterior anterior gradient. So like as much as the cortex has usually primary, secondary, and third representation like S1, S2, or V1, V2, V3, V4, you might think of the insula as an interoceptive cortex where you have a primary afferent from the body where you get signals of temperature, lust, hunger, pain, whatever. And this information is then remapped in more and more abstract representation, like from posterior to anterior. When it comes to pain, you can see it very beautifully in most of all my data, that when you really get pain, you have a whole posterior, mid, and anterior gradient in the insula. And when you do this kind of abstract empathy task, as I use, you always only show anterior. You never have posterior, really, and also not the contralateral posterior part of the insula. And that fits well with data of other people who use touch, for example, and they could really see when they looked at the time course how the receipt of touch and the anticipatory response of anticipation that you get touch or pain only activate the anterior insula. So the idea is that the anterior insula is a more abstract representation of what the body is actually feeling, which allows you for a conscious representation of I feel, I'm a person who feels, this is what is going on in my body. And that also allows you to simulate what other might feel and simulate what you might feel in time. Yeah. So, if you have to anticipate pain which is not there yet, you can use the anterior insula to do that. Right. And so I guess this is, I think.
So I love this. And now it goes back to Robert's point because, by the way, gastric distension activates the same two areas. Am I right?
Yes.
They're activated with lots and lots. I'm not saying that love gives you a bellyache. I'm saying that these areas are obviously, these pathways have been used before. What's, I think, different, and these are the comments you just made, is it seems to be the anterior insula that is highly evolved, that is actually more properly thought of, is this interoceptive conceptual area. In other words, I know what I am in this place and time, and because I know who I am, I can see where you are. It's a more abstract quality of information processing. So I'm hoping that the neuroscience is good enough to get us to the point where we can understand better these circuit properties.
So one idea about the anterior insula is that it's tracking peripheral interoceptive signals. This idea goes all the way back to William James, okay, how he thought about emotion as being generated by the periphery. And that's also an implicit assumption about Craig's ideas. Yeah. Another idea is that it's just feeling. You don't need the periphery, right? And this sounds like a chicken and egg question, but it's kind of an important mechanistic question. Ritchie has data where he asked meditators and non-meditators to monitor their heart rate. Now, who do you think would be more accurate in monitoring their heart rate?
Meditators.
Right, but that's what Ritchie thought, but in fact it was the opposite. Now, I'm not saying that's taking things a little literally, but is it important to make this, to think about the mechanism and say, well, it could be peripheral stuff. Do we really even need the peripheral stuff? Can we just say it's emotional?
Yeah, I actually, that was the point I was going to bring up. We actually published this paper, which I think was important because it's important in this area in particular, I think, to publish non-findings, where we actually had a very strong hypothesis that it would be one way, and it turned out not to be. And so we administered a very standard measure of visceral self-perception that was gained a lot of attention after Hugo Critchley's 2004 Nature Neuroscience paper, where he showed that individual differences in the performance on this task, which is a measure of a person's ability to detect their heartbeat, it's an objective measure, was correlated with activity in this region of the insula. And so based on the kind of reasoning that we've heard, we hypothesize that long-term practitioners should do better on this task. It's a very simple experiment. And we used several different groups of long-term practitioners. So we included the Tibetan practitioners who were the subject of the studies that I mentioned, but we also included practitioners from other traditions that emphasize the control of autonomic processes, yogic traditions. And none of them performed any better than complete novice controls. The only difference that we found is we asked people how confident they were that their responses were accurate. And the meditators were much more confident that they're performing better. That was the only difference that we actually saw. This does raise the kind of question that Brian asked about whether it really is, and goes back to the debate about peripheral versus central models of emotion.
Was there not a paper?
But first, I don't think that this task, the heartbeat detection task, is a very good task for interoceptive awareness. It's more like it's very highly correlated to anxiety. So people who have high anxiety, they're very good in that because they have trained to listen to their heart because of anxiety, basically. So probably, you know, I think we agree that we would need to look for better tasks for interoceptive awareness. The other thing is that Hugo investigated autonomic patients who have an autonomic failure. And there you can clearly see that the insular mediate awareness of, for example, threat in the faces, and that the patients without autonomic response had less of this.
They had less, but there was still a response.
There was still, so I think everyone would agree it's both. You use signal from your body and you use signals from the context to actually, it's a Schachter-Singer kind of later, you know, the mediating hypothesis, I think, of James Lange was that you say you do both. You take the context into account, you take the body signals into account, and both together will create a feeling. And that, I think the insula is a perfect location in the brain to actually do that because it's so highly connected.
Let me keep going. I'll come back. I do want you to comment in just a minute. So, quite frankly, Richie, we need better machines. We need better machines because we need to understand in greater detail where activations occur, when they occur. We need something much better than bold. And so everything else you said was right, but I think we need better machines because I don't think we're going to understand the circuit basis of this until we get there. That's not to say that behavioral measures are not more important, but I think we need better machines.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, and I was just really making a point. But if we did have the kind of machines that you're thinking about, if we can image gene expression non-invasively, that
can
would be
do
a
it
machine
if we can think it. So there's where neuroscience has to do its job, and hopefully with biophysicists and engineers. The second thing, I'll leave it open, but I love this notion that these not just that circuit basis can be explored, but that the neuronal basis of this might be explored through attention to these von Economo neurons that seem so clearly localized in these brain regions, the ones we've just talked about, and are very clearly found in humans, greater apes, a couple of whales, and elephants. And I'll leave it there, but it's very interesting to me that Bill Seeley and his colleagues at UCSF have shown in frontal temporal dementia, where there is an early complete loss of empathy, these cells are, 90% of these cells are lost in cortices that otherwise look just fine. So one is a comment about the second responsibility is the linkage between neuroscience and Buddhism. And I thought we had a perfect chance today, or maybe in the future, to take your map, if you will, John, and try to map neuroscience onto that cognitive map, that understanding that the Buddhists have given us through so many, many years of contemplation. Isn't that a place, it's a question for you, John, isn't that a place where we might begin to map brain structure onto cognitive structure? And please say something if you will.
I think that there's actually a meeting this summer that is being organized to try to take a stab at that, and Jim is also involved in that meeting. And there's some potential, and I think we've already made some advance. And that the one caution I would have is lining up the first person and the third person, a phenomenological account with a neuroscientific account can be messy and sometimes could be misleading. But I do think there's a lot of potential there, at least for generating some good questions and hypotheses.
And the last really reflection is to Jimpa. I said to him yesterday, so what does it feel like when you're in a state of compassion? What does it feel like? I mean, what are the thoughts you have? What about your heartbeat? What about your skin? I mean, I need to hear that. A neuroscientist needs to hear the experiment that speaks and says, after 34,000 hours, I sort of know what I'm thinking. Even if I don't trust what they're saying, I need to hear it. So Jimpa, say something. Teach me.
I'm the wrong person, actually. We have Brian and some of his colleagues, and I'm partly involved in planning some experiments on adepts. So we will have some of these adepts coming through Stanford, and hopefully, we will have an opportunity to ask them, what does it feel like to be in that state? I was going to ask Tania a question. I mean, my own personal kind of, wish is to really, it's one thing to do experiments on adepts and to really see what human mind and heart is capable of and the potentials there are. But kind of personally, as a father of 2 young children, where I'm interested in is how much of that can be actually done by ordinary person on the street, in whose life real differences can be made. So with that thought, the question I have for you, Tania, is that increasingly through developmental psychologist work and other psychologist work and your work, the way in which Western thought is conceptualizing compassion and altruism, empathy really seem to have a very central role to play. So therefore, a lot would depend on how clear we are in kind of articulating and conceptualizing what we mean by empathy. What is this phenomenon? And a lot of your work seems to be really based on kind of empathy in relation to pain, physical pain, seeing of physical pain. And so would you kind of, speculate or hypothesize that even though the current work done is on very visible concrete pain sensations, that the same kind of processes will be observed if you make the pain more psychological, less obvious, but something that would require on the part of the person who is observing it some understanding of the other person's feelings and psychological processes. So that's one question.
Yes, I'm sure.
Okay.
I just think perhaps not as strong.
Okay.
But I think that's just a matter of how good you are in imagining basically the suffering of another person. And I think for some people it's even easier to imagine psychological suffering than pain. I experienced when we did some piloting.
Sure.
Some people, they have difficulty in, when you say imagine they have pain on the hand, nothing happened. But if you say imagine they really suffering the loss of a wife, or they very, very easily.
Okay. Yeah. So the other question is that if empathy is turning out to be so crucial for generation of pro-social behavior and compassion and altruistic kind of behavior, then does that mean that the ability to think in terms of we as human beings, members of the same family, the kind of consciousness that people like His Holiness and other visionary leaders are talking about that is necessary to survive in the 21st century, will that arising of that kind of consciousness depend upon empathy? Or would you think it's a different path?
It's a different. I really think that the empathy work is basically just the base on which I think compassion can arise. But that was very, for me, very elucidating to work with Mathieu, because we wanted to understand the pattern first we observed when we tested our empathy for pain paradigm. So we asked him, could you stop doing your compassion and just imagine the person suffering, but you just stay there? Basically like what Tracy told us, like the distress. Just feel the pain and distress, but please don't go into compassion. And it took us, half a day to explain what he should do, because he's like, how should I not go into compassion? I mean, into this love and this concern. So he said, because of research, I try to do that. I just imagine the suffering, I take it on my own skin, but I don't transform it into love or into concern and to compassion. And he said it was nearly unbearable. And he really begged me through the loudspeaker of the scanner whether he can now do metta, just to transform this feeling of unbearableness into compassion. And it was very, very strong experience, I think. And I think I understood that he said, actually, it's really good to do this exercise first, because now you really understand why it's so necessary to transform it into compassion and concern and love, because you feel how unbearable it is. And I think what happens in all the health system is that people are not trained to transform the empathy into a real compassion and love, because that's not what we do. I mean, we run away from, it's an aversive feeling. What we don't learn to actually approach an aversive feeling. And I think if you don't train that into a major extent, you will have burnout, or you get cynical, or you do, emotion regulation, you don't feel anything anymore. And so I think that will be the big task also for children. I would love, if we can see that it works for adults, transport it into schools, and to see that actually you can teach children to really develop actively this. But I would say you need first to start with empathy, to sensitize to the other, and then on top of that you do the work on transformation to love. But that's an empirical, I guess. Yeah.
last statement.
I just want to make one comment in response to Jimpa's comment. We've just finished collecting data from a large sample of kids 8 years old. And we have them come in for part of this study is a behavioral task that where in one part the experimenter is holding a clipboard and feigns getting a finger stuck in the clipboard and has an expression of pain in response to clipping her finger. And we videotape the kids' responses to this. And if you look at a large sample, 100 kids 8 years old, you see a very diverse range of responses. And we've been able to distinguish what we've been calling very tentatively positive valence empathy from negative valence empathy. And the positive valence empathy, the prototype is the kid who sees this and goes over and kisses the finger of the experimenter. And just a completely spontaneous reaction. And other kids will show the pain of the other, but have no, there's no positive affect and no attempt to instill positive affect in the person who's suffering. And there are different neural correlates of this. And so I think, and this is just spontaneous displays of different kinds of empathic reactions that are naturally occurring in 8-year-old kids. So I think that there'll be some interesting differences that we could observe in these kinds of situations as we go forward in the future.
Can I just add a comment just on what you're talking about? Because it's a study we did 30 years ago in a totally different field of science, really, and I don't think anyone ever has noticed it. It's never been cited in the literature. And what we did was to look at 5-year-olds and 8-year-olds while they witnessed on television a killing. And we were able to classify whether when they saw the killing they showed excitement and glee and sometimes imitating, or did they show sadness, fear, or pain. Immediately after they thought they were in a waiting room, we put them in a situation where they could help another child, or they could cause another child to suffer pain, for which I got chastised a lot. But the kids who, when they saw it, showed glee, they tried to hurt another child. While the kids who showed sadness, fear, and pain, they tried to help. So it was not the event, it was an interaction between the event and the emotional response to the event. I never have thought before of applying that in this context, but it fits this context.
Send out the paper, we'll cite it.
Thank you.